and welcome back to my YouTube channel. And today I'm going to be talking about watercolor paints 101. So basically most things that you're going to need to know about watercolor paints. This video could be for beginners or even could be for very experienced artists, but this is more faced towards beginners. So yes, let's get straight on into this video. Alright, so we're starting out very basic, and I'm going to tell you guys about the different types of watercolor paints. Okay, so first we have this palette kind, where they go in this little palette. And by the way, this is actually definitely not a very good watercolor palette. It's fine quality, but I just don't use this kind very often, so I have the super cheap kind that's not the best. But it still works pretty good. So this is a palette kind. So it comes in a palette like this. Alright, so this is the palette type of watercolor. So as you can probably see, this is literally like a palette with little watercolor cans inside. So these are little cans of watercolor paint. And how this works, alright, so I have my paper here and my watercolor. And what you do is you take a paintbrush. I'm going to do a video on watercolor brushes 101. But anyways, you take a paintbrush, you take a cup of water, and you just dip your paintbrush in your cup of water. So your paintbrush is soaking wet. And then you put it on one of these little palettes and rub it like this. Oops, sorry guys, I just realized you guys can't see that. So you put the water on this little paint palette here on whatever color that you want to use, and you just rub around the water on top of the color that you want to use. And then you have all the paint loaded up on your brush, and then you paint it on your paper like that. And that kind is pretty good. And yeah. I really like this kind of watercolor also because it is super simple and fun to use. And I just feel like this is a pretty cool one, especially for beginners, because all you have to do is wet your paint and then you are, well, good to go. And this kind of watercolor set can range in price quite a lot actually, but I'll talk about the pricing in a while. So yeah, that is the cubed or palette type of watercolor. Alright, so the next type of watercolor that I want to show you is the tubed watercolor. Alright, so this is literally in tubes. So I'm just going to grab a color and show you guys. So it's actually just a tube of watercolor. These are pretty simple too, but you do have to add water to them. So yeah. I got this one off Amazon for I think around $25, $26. And these watercolor paints, oh my gosh, I love these ones. I use them all the time. But again, I'll be talking about the pricing and what kinds you should get a little later. And just like the other ones, these come in so many different shades and tones of colors. This is my favorite kind of watercolor, but you would want to use these when you're a little bit more experienced with watercolor. You could start out using these, but I would recommend using the palette kind of watercolor first. But now let me show you how this works. Alright, so this is a tubed watercolor. But for this type of watercolor, you will need a palette. And if you're facing toward this, then you can... I got my palettes at Dollar Tree for a 6-pack at Dollar Tree, so $1 for a 6-pack of these paint palettes. So that's pretty cool. But all you do is you put just a little paint. So you put just a little paint in your container. So then it looks like this. But this kind of is like regular paint except super gooey. So what you do to make it look like watercolor is you take a brush, dip it in some water, well, a lot of water, then put a whole bunch of water in your palette with your color. Then you mix your watercolor paint, your tubed watercolor paint, with a whole bunch of water, and boom, this is watercolor. I just like this kind more because for me it's a little bit easier, and I don't know, it just gives a little bit of a different effect, which I absolutely love. Alright, so now that you know the basic two kinds of watercolor, we're going to talk about the pricing and what kind of watercolor is bad and good. Alright, so I'm going to go from cheap to expensive. So here I have this watercolor set that I actually got from Dollar Tree, and this is a pretty good watercolor set. I mean, obviously it has some complications. I would not recommend this, but for a beginner, I can definitely see this being useful and great. Also, the colors are very bright, vibrant, and have a lot of pigment. And this is the palette kind of watercolor. So here, let me show you how good it is. Alright, so here I have my watercolor paper, and I get my brush wet, like always. Then I put the water on the color of paint that I want. I'm going to do this dark blue so you guys can see better. This and rub it around. Then once the color starts to gather on my brush like this, I go ahead and put it on my paper. And as you can see, it's okay. It's obviously not the best watercolor you could find, but it's pretty good considering the pricing. This was only $1 at the dollar store. So yeah, that's really good considering. But you can see the cheap quality in this watercolor, and it just doesn't spread far at all. The pigment is fading out very quickly. And yeah, I would not recommend this watercolor set overall, but for beginners and considering how cheap it is, this is pretty good. And if you're a very beginner watercolor and you just want to kind of test it out and see if this is the kind of art that you want to do, then this is absolutely a great thing to start with because it gives you kind of the basic idea of painting with watercolor, how hard it is, how easy it is. But yeah, overall, I'm pretty impressed with this watercolor set. But again, it's only $1. You can see the cheap quality. You can see there's little grids in here like that. You can see there's a whole bunch of it has a very gritty texture, which does mean that this watercolor is pretty low quality, and they put too little pigment, and it's drying out very quickly also. So that's pretty low quality, but for how cheap it is, I wouldn't probably recommend, but for how cheap it is, it's fairly good. So yeah, all watercolor sets that you get for under $1 are going to be either this low quality or lower quality. Definitely that doesn't go any higher than this with $1 watercolor sets. But now, let's move on. Then we have this watercolor set that I showed you guys earlier, and I'm not sure the exact pricing, but I think this was around $9.99. But I am not completely sure. I think it was around $10. And like I showed you guys earlier, these are pretty good quality. And considering how cheap these are pretty great. But again, I'm not totally sure how much this was. I'm sort of just guessing, and I have a little bit of a memory for this. So yeah, let me paint a little splotch on my paper, and then I'll show you guys how gritty it is. Okay, so this is how it looks. As you might be able to see, it's just a little bit gritty, but not too much. And it's very high in pigment, which you always want to see. In high quality watercolor, it should always be high in pigment, which means very bright, colorful, and it's like a little bit gritty, kind of a different texture. I don't really know how to explain it, but anyways. So yeah, this watercolor set is pretty good overall. And this watercolor set is from Basic or something like that. And then we get into a little bit more expensive watercolor sets, such as the tube ones I was showing you guys earlier. The tube ones seem to be more expensive in general, so If you're into tube watercolors, they just might be a little bit more expensive, no matter what. But yeah, I absolutely love these. And like I said, I think these were around $24. And you saw how they looked earlier, so yeah. But if you don't remember, this is how they looked. Super good and not gritty at all. And then you get into these super expensive watercolor sets, which I do not own any of because I find that cheap watercolor works fine for me. But they make watercolors that are so expensive, you have to get them individually. Like I know some watercolors where each watercolor itself is $15, so it just depends on the watercolor. And you can get most types of watercolor individually, tubes and even the little palette watercolors. So yeah. In some watercolor sets, these palettes can pop out, and in some they can't. A few like palettes or something, like these little palettes over here, then that would be fine. But just so you know, I don't think you can get the whole plastic palette thing around these little watercolor things like separate. So you might want to get one of these with the watercolor in it, because I don't know if you can find them anywhere else. Okay guys, so I hope that you guys enjoyed that watercolor 101. And yeah, bye guys. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to give it a thumbs up.